10 undeniable consequences of climate change. Number 10. More wildfires. The effects of climate change crop up pretty much across the spectrum, from immediate to century-spanning, from barely perceptible to completely world-changing. But of all the consequences, one of the most noticeable is probably wildfires. Since the 80s, the devastating environmental phenomenon has become even more dangerous in pretty much every metric you can think of. Evidence has shown that around the world, over the last 4 decades, they've come to occur 5 times as often, affect 6 times the land area, and burn 5 times longer. While this is happening across the globe, it's most famously occurring in California. In the last decade, the state has faced 7 of its 10 worst wildfires ever. According to a 2018 study in the journal Earth's Future, trends like this can be attributed to increased temperatures as a result of climate change, since drier soils are more vulnerable to fire. If this trend isn't curbed, it's possible that all, yes, all of California's forests burn down and make way for plains and grassland by the end of the century. The only way to solve it is to, stop climate change. Easy, right? Number 9. Rising sea levels. Okay, you're probably very well aware of rising sea levels as an effect of global warming. Chances are you've already seen pictures like polar bears on shrinking glaciers or a significantly shriveled up map of Florida's coastline. One of the most commonly cited predictions came from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2013, who calculated that by the year 2100, sea levels could rise up to a metre. That could cause coastal areas around the world to become completely uninhabitable this century, except by merfolk, of course, so Aquaman is the only one benefiting from any of this. But fast forward to 2019 and it's looking even worse than that. Due to ice in Greenland and Antarctica melting faster than anticipated, models are now expanding what they call likely outcomes. That means sea levels could rise as much as 2.4 meters in that time. In real terms, that means the Earth's landmass would decrease by around 1.8 million kilometers, roughly the area of Libya. That could mean hundreds of millions of displaced people from coastal areas the world over. Number 8. Longer growing seasons. As the overwhelming evidence of climate change mounts up, most of the discussions are about what we're losing and what's decreasing, whether it's resources, landmass, or biodiversity. But here's one thing that's not going down. In fact, it's going up. That's the length of growing seasons, which is defined as frost-free periods of over 5 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's great, right? Longer growing seasons means more food and means less hunger. Well, I hate to break it to you, but even that probably isn't a great thing in the long run. It is the case that these conditions are leading to a greater yield of certain crops, and we're even seeing forested areas expanding in some parts of the world. Now that's pretty cool, despite being pretty warm, but the problem isn't so much that itself as what comes along with it. That's because while this can be positive sometimes, it can also lead to greater proliferation of harmful species of fungi and ticks. They damage wildlife, crop yields, and even human populations. So even with longer growing seasons, that can lead to more harm than good. Number 7. Food insecurity. Thanks to ever-improving farming technology over the last few decades, more than 200 million people have been lifted out of hunger. But as the reality of climate change sets in, there's a real risk that progress could be undone just as quickly unless we make real changes. But this is a particularly difficult challenge because the situation is so complicated. Right now, 30% of all emissions are caused by agriculture as an industry. That's according to a report by the World Economic Forum. That means there's already a huge impetus on the industry to reduce its contribution to the ongoing climate crisis. But there's also growing pressure to increase food output as the world's population grows ever higher. That's made even more complicated by the fact that modern farming practices have already damaged soil fertility and harmed biodiversity. The end result is that global production is set to drop by 20%, with more people than ever in need of food thanks to rising populations. So in the next few decades, we're going to have to find a way to farm more efficiently while polluting less. Now that's quite a challenge, but hopefully not an insurmountable one. Number 6. Ice-free Arctic. Perhaps the most iconic and terrifying image of climate change is that of the ice caps melting. And often that's framed as a century-spanning problem, where they slowly dwindle over the decades until there's nothing left. But actually, it's a lot more urgent than that, at least on a seasonal level. At this point, scientific models are consistently suggesting that within the next few decades, the Arctic Circle will be devoid of ice in the summer months. At worst, it's possible that this could happen within the next 20 years. It's not really Arctic without ice, is it? There's a whole host of issues that go along with that. As you already know, there's the problem with rising sea levels, but even if it's only for the summer months, that can lead to deeper, darker, and more heat-absorbing oceans. This will cause global temperatures to rise faster. That effectively means that the earlier effects of climate change make the later effects happen even quicker. It's somewhat of a snowball effect, but without the snow. That's kind of the problem. All of this means that it's imperative that we stop the unsnowball rolling before it gets out of control. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should be doing to stop the catastrophe of climate change? Let me know in the comments down below. Number 5. Increasing conflict. The problems that arise from climate change are not isolated. They all interact and compound on each other, often leading to some hugely damaging secondary effects. One that's becoming increasingly evident is the risk of conflict. When resources become constrained, whether it's water shortages, food shortages, or uninhabitable conditions, it becomes ever more likely that populations become desperate. That creates an unstable situation that's primed for conflict and exploitation. The Horn of Africa, including Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Sudan, and South Sudan, is particularly susceptible to this effect. Stress on resources can be a major factor in the destabilization of these already uncertain political regimes, which face threats from terrorists and militias alike. And this isn't just an abstract fear, by the way. The signs of climate conflict are already showing up. For example, in 2012, after towns in Somalia had been hit by climate-related droughts, terrorist group Al-Shabaab began cutting off water supplies to liberated towns as a military tactic. So it's highly likely that as climate change effects escalate, more rogue groups will begin exploiting desperate populations for territorial gains. Number 4. Rising temperature. Now, I know what you're thinking here. Well, yeah, obviously, it's in the name, dummy. But it's worth mentioning that calling people dummy is rude, but also just what could happen if global temperatures get much hotter, considering how often we hear about targets for temperatures above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Climate Agreement, which has been signed by 194 states plus the European Union, has the stated aim of preventing an increase of over 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible, and keeping well below 2. But what would actually happen at those levels? Bear in mind we're past 1.1 degree already. According to Carbon Brief, 1.5 will cause 1.1 months of heat waves every year, 9% less fresh water, 40 centimeters higher oceans, and 90% of coral reefs at bleaching risk. At 2 degrees, up that to 1.5 months, 17% less water, and 98% bleached coral. That's all pretty awful already, but any higher than that and things become catastrophic. The Intergovernmental Panel at Climate Change predicts that at 4 degrees, southern Africa and the Mediterranean could lose half its water supply and 35% of its crops. And at 5 degrees, well, say goodbye to New York, London, and Tokyo. Number 3. Rain patterns. Despite the outdated term global warming, climate change isn't just the direct consequences of increased global temperatures. It's becoming ever more apparent that the balance of global weather patterns is going to shift quite dramatically. Not quite the day after tomorrow dramatically, but still dramatically. Now, according to the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, every extra degree Celsius of global temperature means that clouds can store 7% more vapor. So if we don't meet Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees, we'll see at least 14% more precipitation. Maths. The extra rain is going to fall in places that are already susceptible to it, most likely the more humid parts of Asia. But as precipitation increases, that's balanced out by evaporation in the soil. That means droughts, and lots of them, particularly in areas like the Mediterranean and southern Africa. So while you could just sum it up as wet gets wetter, dry gets drier, there's even more to be worried about here. The changes in global weather conditions appear to be pushing tropical cyclones away from the equator at a rate of 60 kilometers per decade, meaning milder parts of the world could start seeing extreme weather. In other words, might be worth investing in a big old life raft. Number 2. Biodiversity loss. Even ignoring climate change as a factor, there are already a lot of causes of biodiversity loss around the world. Population growth, deforestation, overhunting, the list goes on. However, by 2050, climate change is said to be the leading cause of habitat destruction and biodiversity loss around the world. Those aforementioned coral reefs are the most obvious and current example. Half of the Great Barrier Reef has already died because of increased ocean temperatures killing algae it feeds on, and that's only getting worse, and it's expected to reach 90% of all reefs in the Pacific Ocean. But the biodiversity problem isn't just linked to climate change, it's fighting against the solutions. For example, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services says that bioenergy, which is created by living organisms, is going to take between 10 and 30 times more land than it already does in the coming decades. In other words, it's not just climate change damaging biodiversity, fighting climate change is doing it too. You're damned if you do, you're even more damned if you don't. Number 1. Humanitarian crises. As climate change begins to set in, it's going to happen in a variety of ways. Some will be gradual, but some will hit like a ton of bricks, at least for certain communities. In particular, the poorest around the world are likely to face even more humanitarian crises than they already do. Perhaps the most significant change we're likely going to see around the world is the number of climate refugees skyrocketing, as conditions become untenable for people in areas most susceptible to climate change. According to a 2018 report by the World Bank, there are likely to be 143 million climate-based migrants in 2050 from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia alone. Similarly, the Institute for Economics and Peace think tank claims there are currently 1 billion people at risk, many of whom could end up being displaced. But there's another big problem here. I used the term just now climate refugee, but that's not actually a legally recognised status, since refugees need to be fleeing persecution. That means without major change, we could feasibly see millions of people displaced with no legal rights. So that was 10 undeniable consequences of climate change. Which one worries you the most? Let me know in the comments down below. Also give this video a like and subscribe to All Time 10s if you haven't done so already. You can also click the bell down there too so YouTube tells you when we make videos. In the meantime though, check out this All Time 10s video on screen now, while you still can.